Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
A Time for Truth Show is sponsored by the Office of Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, a periodontal, dental implant and laser specialist in New York City, for over 40 years. Dr. Fialkoff was honored by the International College of Dentists and Pierre Fauchard, and received the Presidential Lifetime Humanitarian Honor from the White House. Call us at 718-229-3838.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to A Time for Truth Show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Many of you have been asking, how do I avail myself of all the previous episodes? Very simple. Go on YouTube, click on A Time for Truth Show. A Time for Truth Show. Hit the subscribe button. There's no charge. We'll be very happy to have you as one of our members. You'll be availed of all the episodes over the last few years. And tonight, we have a very important show because it has to do with feeling right, feeling good, wellness. You know, we talk about wellness. That's the word in the last 5 years. Wellness. And at the same time, we have to look at a statistic that's very frightening, that 20% of the U.S. population, which is about 74 million Americans, are on some form of psychotropic drug. They're not happy. They're anxious. So tonight's show will avail you of some very interesting perspectives that are scientific. And we have with us Dr. Tyran G. Mincey, a doctor, educator, clinician. Buddha, if you put up his pictures on the screen, I'd like the people to see this good-looking doctor on the screen. And he's an author, a Toastmaster, an expert on matters of health, workplace productivity, leadership, explorations, you name it. His views are widespread in academics and healthcare and in other fields. He graduated from Mansfield University with a Bachelor of Science, Northeast chiropractor with a Doctor of Chiropractic, and is a diplomate in applied kinesiology. He has his practices in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, an herbal specialist in nutrition, and noted wellness author, having published 3 books. An engineer, if you will. Let's bring him up live and bid a warm welcome to Dr. Tyran Mincey.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Doc.
It's a pleasure.
Likewise.
All right.
So, when you talk to me about this topic, I go, come on, that can't be. And so I didn't take your word for it. I looked and I go, wow, it's really true. So I want to ask you the first question because it blew my mind.
Okay.
How does my gut, non-scientific term, how does my gut or my gastrointestinal system, scientific, my stomach, my intestines, how can that or how does it actually affect my emotions?
It's a good question. And I don't think we know exactly the mechanics of the whole thing, but we know that it does. If we look at the gut, the way the body's wired, there's a thin little nerve that travels right up your body here and goes up to your brainstem. That nerve is called the vagus nerve. And that nerve 95% of the information travels from the gut to the brain, not the other way. So commonly we think that everything that comes from the brain goes and controls the rest of the body. This particular nerve is the exact opposite.
It's quite interesting because obviously if so much information is being transmitted from the gut to the brain, a few things come to mind for me. One is almost like God wired that for survival somehow, that the human being's emotions may be tied in to surviving. And then the other thing that comes to mind is the food that we eat and the toxicity that, you know, I've heard and experienced myself in foods.
Right.
So before we get into that, let me ask the next question, because you had mentioned something and I looked at it also. So we hear so much about this serotonin, right?
Right.
So how much serotonin actually is produced in the gut itself?
Well, there's more serotonin, comparatively speaking, produced in the gut. Most of it's produced in the gut compared to, say, the brain, where people say, oh, you have a chemical imbalance and it's because you have serotonin issues. When the reality is most of that serotonin is produced in the gut, and even more is produced by red blood cells. So if we say there's a brain imbalance and it's caused by serotonin, we're kind of off really far, because really what you have then is a gut imbalance. And well, giving someone a drug that corrects a brain imbalance doesn't make sense then, when you know that, when you have that information. So something like 95% of the serotonin is produced in the gut.
In the gut. And you know, it's amazing. I'm a periodontist for 44 years, implant surgeon. And I recently had a woman who was taking Paxil, which is selective serotonin uptake inhibitor, that tries to raise her serotonin so she feels better. But there's so many scientific studies that show that this same drug affects our implant success rate because it affects the bone.
Oh.
And so, I was looking at it and I saw that the serotonin effect is not just the positive or minus, it depends on where it binds in these little receptors. So what I was going to ask you, because as you're talking about the gut and the interaction with the vagus nerve, how much do we actually know about this serotonin interaction with the receptors? Because when I looked online, it made no sense to me. If you go positive, it's better, but if you go negative, it's not. But you go this way, it's not. And I said, well, this is very confusing.
Right. And the reality is it's not. The gut is not a simple kind of thing, right? So you have the gut, the digestive system, which we're calling the gut. You have the fact that it produces its own chemicals completely separate from the rest of the body. So it's called, in some cases, the second brain, because it does its own separate thing, and then it impacts what happens a little bit higher. So we don't fully understand it. There's a book that's been written, I've forgotten the author's name, but it's called The Second Brain. There are documentaries on. It's currently being explored. But we know that when we address how a person's gut functions, that we decrease the number of emotional complaints substantially. And we know that as people age, if the gut is not in good health, we get a larger number of cognitive problems. Clinicians can see it. If there are other clinicians that manage patients, they're sitting there shaking their head. They might not know why, and some may not care, because in professions where you just give medication, it's not as much of an issue or a concern.
Right.
But for us, we don't give the medication. Our medication, our medicine is the food.
Nutrition.
That's right. So we look at, well, how do we correct this gut or get this gut functioning optimally without the use of the things that would harm it? Without the use of drugs that boost serotonin, because no one has a problem because of a lack of that drug in their diet. They have a problem because something's creating an imbalance. And a lot of things do. So I think the bigger question beyond serotonin, because it's going to be completely dependent on what goes in the body, what's digested and what's utilized, and what goes in the body that's poison that blocks it from doing its job. So a lot of people's cognitive emotional imbalances stem from environmental concerns and the toxic food supply that we've had over the years. I've literally watched it over the years, over 27 years. You see the number of gut, gastrointestinal, and emotional complaints go up just like that together.
That's quite amazing because I look at the scientific numbers and statistics in our country. And it's interesting because as you're mentioning this, I look at, we have irritable bowel syndrome. And so many people suffering from this. We have people who are overweight with diabetes.
Right.
Especially in my Latin community. Unfortunately, we have great tasting food, but with the fried bananas and the pastry of guava, and we really know how to make tasty things. Unfortunately, we suffer from a lot of diabetes. But as you were talking, I started thinking, I said, wow, how many of these people are actually suffering emotionally because of what's going on? And so that's what I wanted to ask you, if you could speak a little bit about this, a little bit more, and what you recommend in terms of nutrition.
Well, first, we recommend a sort of a back to basics approach. When people come in and they're suffering from emotional complaints, one of the biggest things you see are poor food choices, processed foods, packaged foods, and these don't offer any type of nutritional benefit. In fact, what they do is they create nutritional deficiencies. So every time you eat some of these foods that are processed, you deplete your vitamins, and then you desire more food. You just keep depleting your vitamins like this, and ultimately the body can't function if it doesn't have the raw material it needs. So emotional complaints are going to come in part from processed foods that make the person not have enough energy, not have enough, because the sugar is the food that the brain uses. Sugar is the food that the brain uses. I said it twice on purpose. Sugar is the food that the brain uses. It cannot store it. Other organs, other parts of the body can actually store sugar. The brain can't. So when you eat a meal that is not correct, not balanced, the sugar levels will go low. And when they do, you may get cognitive issues. And for some people, their sugar levels going low all day long. They eat junk, they come back up, they go down, they come back up, they go down, they come back up, they go down. And every time it goes down, they're emotional, moody, hard to get along with, can't work well, a cognitive mess, can't respond to stress, because of what they put in their mouth and the poor choices they made. And listen, it's not an argument about how something tastes, because that's not what this is about. It's an argument about the quality of the food. And I would argue, you talked about traditional preparations of meals. What you're eating now is not what your great grandmother ate. It's not the same thing. And so it's important to realize that what you put in your mouth will impact your cognitive ability, will impact your mood, and impact a whole bunch of other things.
Well, it's very interesting because then I would think if the brain doesn't get enough sugar, like anyone who feels threatened, the brain would send out some sort of alarm.
Right.
Through some kind of neurotransmitter, right? Or nerve impulse.
Right. There's different kinds, but yes.
So I'm sure the viewers probably saying, well, what happens then? Because, I went on this diet and I wasn't feeling too good. And what Dr. Mincey is saying is correct. So what can happen then when this happens, the sugar drops? What happens with the brain connection to the gut or to your appetite or to whatever?
Depends. If it happens chronically and it happens all the time, you have a backup system, right? We know backup systems are important. And so let's say you're going along and, you decide, you get into this habit of getting up first thing in the morning, and the first thing you do is you have a coffee, a sugar, and a donut. All right? That donut's going to spike your blood sugar, and you're going to be asleep probably in a few hours after that. And this is what people do. They consume this type of thing, and then they don't wonder why they don't have enough energy. As soon as it crashes, they go, "Oh man, I don't have enough energy. So let me go get some more coffee and another donut." What does it do? Spikes it and crashes it. And after they do this for a while, the body starts losing its ability to really use its backup. The backup is the stress system. And as long as the stress system is not overutilized, it will do its job, which is to get you out of harm's way. You can imagine if you were going through a forest and you saw a wild coyote, he started growling at you. What would you do? Well, you'd run. That'd probably be the right thing to do, or some say that'd be the wrong thing to do. But either way, you take measures to either defend yourself or escape.
Right.
You'd have some brute force, you'd have more strength than you ordinarily would, and you'd be very alert. Why? Because you'd have adrenaline flowing. And adrenaline comes from a little tiny gland, which is just on top of your kidneys. It's called your adrenal gland. And that's your backup system. So every time you don't eat properly, you stimulate the backup system.
Interesting.
The backup system gives you enhanced cognitive ability. It gives you greater strength. It gives you an alert outlook. But I ask you, there's probably a fire extinguisher in here somewhere. If there is an emergency and you put out the fire, how good would the fire extinguisher be the next time? Right. It'd probably still work if there was one in 2 or 3 days. But what if there was a fire every single day?
Right.
And this is how, especially in this country, we live. We have exhausted our reserve because of the food supply. And then we do terrible things to our gut. Now, no reserve, terrible things to the gut, which remember, 95% of the information from the gut goes up. What's it going to tell the brain? Maybe not much. And the brain also doesn't have any backup sugar to operate off of. So now what happens? There's something to do and the person can't figure it out. There's an emergency. I can't figure it out. So what do? I have an anxiety attack. I withdraw instead of engage because I can't think with this. And people don't understand this. These glands work with the rest of the body. They never die, but they often don't function well. And it ties back directly to what we call a blood sugar handling stress.
Very interesting. And you know, something that I'm sure the viewers have read about or know about, they hear about, is that because in our society we don't sleep well, because we have too much stress, that this hormone called cortisol starts to come out. So my questions to you for the viewers is, where does cortisol come from? Okay. And you know, how does cortisol relate to the adrenaline? I was saying epinephrine, which is adrenaline. The adrenaline. How does that correlate with what's going on here?
Oh, it's one of my favorite conversations, by the way. Cortisol is made in the adrenal glands, the little gland we just talked about.
Same gland.
That's right. Yeah, it's made in the inside of the gland.
It's almost like the fire station.
Right, right. It's also like, do you remember the little gum you used to chew? And you had the outside of the gum, and then when you bit into it, the inside squirted out? Right. Well, that little gland has the inside, and that's where the cortisol comes from. It squirts, so it goes out, and it is a hormone of survival. So your adrenals make 50 different hormones. You cannot survive without them. And cortisol is one of those hormones. But out of all the 50 hormones, when the adrenal's not healthy, when it's stressed, when you don't eat properly, the cortisol levels go up because the cortisol forces the body to release more what? What's the fuel that the brain likes? Sugar. The body's going to release stored up sugar. The cortisol is the way that happens. But what happens when your adrenals are exhausted?
It doesn't get excreted.
They don't make the cortisol. And what happens? There's no response. Again, another reason for no cognitive response. So we got 1, blood sugar, 2, too much cortisol, 3, not enough cortisol. All this because of what you chose to eat over the last 10 or 15 years, by the way. This doesn't happen like in one day. This is something that you've trained your body to
over time.
Over time, yeah. It's not like people come in, they're like, I don't understand why this happened today. It didn't happen today. It happened 15 years ago. You know, we talk about like inheritances and how we want to leave great things for our children.
That's right.
And people come along, we talk about, you know, creating generational wealth, right?
Right.
What we don't talk about is like generational health. Like, what are you doing to make sure that your children, that legacy that you're leaving, isn't one of death and disease? You know, and the reality is, unfortunately, That's happening. We can change it, but that has happened. So with this knowledge now, you know that you can actually change the way you eat slowly, because you can't change it in the day, but you can make better choices. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so, what general advice would you give someone in terms of nutrition or vitamins, whatever?
Well, the general advice is, just because you can do something, or in this case, just because you can't eat something, doesn't mean you have to all the time. And the world is filled with lots of wonderful things. I think I read last that there's probably 400,000 edible plants on this planet, or 400,000 species of plants. I think about 300,000 are edible. We have lots of choices of things that we can eat. And so the first thing I would say is diversity. Get out of the habit of eating the same thing. When you go to the grocery store, tell the grocer you want some things different. They'll order it if they know people will buy it. And I think that's it. Try to start off having real food. What's real food? Real food is food that rots. Well, what's that mean? Okay, so we'll go back even more basic than that. What's real food? Something not in a package. Something in the outside of the grocery store. So that'd be a fruit, a vegetable, a root, right? Some meat. Why don't we start there?
Right.
There's real basic stuff. And people kind of go, well, gee, what would I eat then? Well, if you're saying, gee, what would I eat then? We already know there's a problem, but you can still change. Pick one. Just go to the store, pick one vegetable, pick one form of meat, and start there. First of all, it's an adventure. You got lots of options. Secondarily, your body will thank you.
Very interesting. Because people nowadays are suffering, I can see it in my own practice, overweight.
Right.
I see so many of them coming in with so many different types of anxiety medications that they're on, or emotional disturbances, and needing to control that. And I see that they come in, they have a little time. As soon as they come in, they're looking at their watches because they have to go back out. And, it's really horrific. You have a practice, and you have a few practices. So how can someone reach you?
Oh, I'm easy to find. The internet, integratedhealthcare.us. It's pretty easy to find. Or my name, Dr. Tyran Mincey. I pop up pretty easily. And I'm right now pretty much over the bridge in New Jersey, not too far away. I think the average commute time for our patients is anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. So they don't live in the area. They all come from out of town, which is good. But yeah, that's the easiest way to find me.
Interesting. And how did you decide to take up this field?
Wow. Well, many years ago, I read an article about health and found out, I mentioned before that you could get healthier by taking vitamins and, doing things. So I started this little vitamin company, and I started making recommendations to people. And, the compliance was less than what I wanted it to be. And one of the biggest, this is back in 1991, by the way, one of the biggest issues was their doctor told them not to take it. Then I happened to, at the same time, be working doing corporate sales in Manhattan. And anyway, I would knock on hundreds of doors a day, and I got to meet lots of doctors. And the coolest ones were the chiropractors. So I decided I wanted to go back to school to do that, and came home and announced that to my wife, who was somewhat shocked, and went to school, and it was amazing. Fell in love with the actual work that I do. Most people don't know this, but within the chiropractic profession, there are something like 200 different methods of practice. Applied kinesiology, that's what I do, is one of those methods. And I met Dr. Goodhart, who was the founder. And there was actually an article in Time magazine about him. They call him the man with magic fingers. And it was brilliant. It put all the pieces together. It looked at the idea that structure could create problems and illness, but also that there could be things that come from the diet, the lifestyle, the environment. And so there was this whole person treatment concept that was there. And chiropractic, getting a chiropractic adjustment is definitely a gift and a good thing for everybody. However, all problems are not caused by an absence of an adjustment. So instead of having one tool, a powerful tool, an adjustment, I now had this arsenal. I had herbs, I had vitamins, I had care for every single joint, every single bone, every single muscle in the body. I had the correlation of those bones and muscles to organs to deal with. I had a history. I could do all these things. It just appeared to become really hard to lose if you use this technique. And so that's how I got here.
Well, it's very interesting because it's more of a causative viewpoint. What I mean by that is it seems like someone can actually see, oh, this is how it's happening. It's not just that they developed it, they don't really know how.
Right.
They have to just, this is a treatment, they still don't know anything.
Right.
And then I have so many of my patients in my own practice who really take a tremendous number of medications. And I think if I asked them, in fact, I had one woman the other day, and I said, what do you take? And she took out this list. And then she said, well, this is for the cholesterol. This is for the blood pressure. This is because this drug affects that. So this is to protect my kidneys. And this is the other one is, you know, because of the heart interaction. And I was listening to her, and, you know, as a doctor, obviously, I understood what she was saying. But I looked at it and I go, you know, it seems like we need to somehow educate this patient
Right.
a little bit more on, okay, what is it that you should do? What you said with nutrition, and what type of, I know you mentioned already a little bit of guidance. What is your feeling in terms of suggestion or recommendation you would have in terms of activity or exercise?
Wow. Well, number one, it's needed. And if we have to start off basic, because some people don't do it, they think if they walk to work or if they do some type of physical activity that somehow equates to exercise. And it doesn't. There's great that you're moving, but we're talking about either exercise that encourages strength or exercise that improves aerobic capacity. And the only way those two happen is if you actually go do something. So real aerobic exercise takes into consideration the person's heart rate. And if there are trainers watching, they may not 100% agree with me, but we're looking at how we enhance a person's health through exercise. Not how we get big muscles in an instant, not how we do a high intensity training class and get injured, but instead for the average person, what do they need to do to make sure they remain healthy, stay healthy, and it can ensure the body stays that way for a long period of time. And some of the programs that are out here don't seem to be going in that direction because they don't take that into consideration. The first thing is you must exercise. You must give yourself at minimum 25, 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week at least. Exercise. It could be walking at a rate that increases the heart rate. I can't give you the heart rate because everybody varies. We do a calculation for that. But make sure they talk to someone who understands and they can help them find the correct heart rate. If the heart rate is incorrect and they exercise, because this is one of the most common mistakes in people who do exercise. The heart rate, they don't even measure it. They just get on the bike or the treadmill and go as fast as they can. And then they feel awful. And then they quit because they've overtrained themselves. And when you're overtrained, there's this gland. It's your stress gland. It's responsible for your stress responses. And it gets a little bit stressed out. It's called your adrenal gland. And what happens? Well, the stress now causes an increase in the secretion of that hormone that we talked about, cortisol, because it's an emergency. And the workout is not at that point an aerobic workout. It's just you going real fast. So you lose all benefit. So the heart rate has to be calculated properly to make sure you're exercising properly. So for people that do exercise, a lot of times they need to slow it down to get benefit. And then you have the other side, people that don't exercise, that don't get the heart rate up even close to high enough to provide any benefit. The literature is clear. Like sometimes the literature is not clear. When I say the literature, I'm talking about the professional refereed journals that doctors and other professionals write. It's clear that exercise is necessary and beneficial for health.
Wow. Well, you know what? As the last show, it gets so exciting that our time flies.
Darn.
And unfortunately, we've lost our time.
Okay.
But it was a great show.
Yes.
And I know that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And, you know, I'm going to, as the last time, I want to invite you back in the future. Be willing to come back?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There's so much to tell.
Every time I'm learning more and more. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. For those of you out there, okay, so find out the proper exercise rate. Find that food that you like in the grocery store. Remember, he told you it's on the outside. The fresh food, not the canned and the boxed. And we will see you on the next episode of A Time for Truth show. Be well.
This show was sponsored by A Time for Truth Foundation Incorporated as a community service.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet